Welcome to Rich Planets TV. I'm Richard D. Hall. On this week's show, we have another live audience discussion in store, and the subject on the table this time is the monetary system. What changes are needed? Mainstream news media channels are littered with economic commentators and experts who talk about national debt, interest rates, inflation, and the pain we must all suffer to get through this economic downturn. But none of these commentators ever question the monetary system itself, and never ask questions such as who creates new money, how does new money get into the economy, and what is debt really being used for? To address these conundrums, I am glad to be joined once again by Ian R. Crane, who has given a series of lectures around the UK and Ireland describing the economic meltdown and financial terrorism. Now, Ian, is financial terrorism not a bit of an extreme term?
I think it's absolutely on the money, no pun intended. What is occurring here is literally the fleecing of the wealth of nations, of corporations, and of individuals. And your introduction is absolutely perfect, because it fits in with an article that's in today's paper on the financial pages of the Daily Mail. And it says, so many experts, so few answers. And yeah, your point is extremely valid. You know, that there's a lot of debate, a lot of discussion, but nobody's really asking the pertinent questions.
Okay, now before we get on to some of those pertinent questions, on last week's show, you introduced some documents because we sort of came to the conclusion last week that Western democracies really don't have much power. And we asked the question, who does have the power? And you described it as a corporate cabal, in other words, large corporations which span national borders. They have the real power. And you introduced these documents which kind of suggest that this is the case. I'd like you to go through them, because we kind of brushed over it last week, one by one in date order, and just introduce these documents and tell me what they are, Ian, and who's authored them.
Okay, I mean, I should emphasise that this is not a definitive list here. I mean, this is just a selection of documents that I thought would be pertinent for the discussions that we were having last week and perhaps even this week. And so I selected 4 because I think that these 4 are very readable. And they're also readily available, so people can access them and browse them at their leisure. This is the first document. It's called the Report from Iron Mountain. The full title is the Report from Iron Mountain on the Possibility and Desirability of Peace. And this is a document that is regularly dismissed as a forgery, whatever that might mean. I mean, we certainly don't know who participated in the think tank that put this together. And the reason it came into the public domain in 1967 was because one of the participants of this working party apparently had an attack of conscience and decided that the essence of their discussion and of their conclusions needed to be put in the public domain. And it emerged as a book, Report from Iron Mountain, and that book was published in 1967, but the committee itself sat 1962-63. And the committee was supposedly commissioned because 1961, of course, was really the start of the Cold War, you know, the building of the Berlin Wall. And so we have this new enemy, the Soviet bloc. And this was actually looking at opportunities, or alternatives, if you like, for controlling a population in the post-Soviet threat era. And the conclusion that these guys ostensibly came up with was that pretty much war's a good thing, you know, because it stimulates the economy, it gives people a focus, and actually none of the alternatives they came up with achieved the same objectives as war itself. Now, if Zbigniew Brzezinski wasn't on that committee, and I have no proof that he was, but if he wasn't, he clearly read it and thought that much of the content in this document was actually worth repeating. And he did this in his book, which you mentioned last week, Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technotronic Era. Now, technotronic is a word back in the 60s that Brzezinski claims to have made up himself. And
just to interrupt there, Brzezinski, tell us, he's sort of been behind successive American governments.
Well, put it in perspective, I mean, Brzezinski is a protege of the guy I mentioned last week, Bernard Baruch, who was a very, very powerful strategist in the early part of the 20th century, and we'll touch on Baruch again because he was instrumental in the establishment of the Federal Reserve in the US in 1913. But Baruch mentored two people to effectively succeed him after he'd exited this mortal coil, and those two people were Zbigniew Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger. Brzezinski was effectively an employee, and still is an employee, of the Rockefellers. He was the guy who identified Jimmy Carter as a potential presidential candidate. He introduced Carter to the Rockefellers. The Rockefellers effectively financed Carter's presidential campaign, and Carter, of course, became president in 1973. And as part of that process, and to get Carter onto the world stage, Brzezinski was also the instigator of the Trilateral Commission. It's a very, very powerful player. He's also, by the way, claimed to be Obama's mentor at Columbia University. Now, this is something that I hesitate to mention, because the official version of events is that Brzezinski mentored Obama, which is, by the way, the moment that Obama threw his hat into the ring and stated that he was running for president, I knew immediately that Obama was going to win, because Brzezinski wasn't going to be supporting a loser. But there are many, many issues surrounding Obama, not least the fact that there is nobody who has come forward who was at Columbia University at the same time as Obama who can remember him being there.
So what are the, I mean, people can get hold of that book?
Absolutely. Go to probably the second-hand book sites like alibri.co.uk or Abe Books, abebooks.co.uk, and use their search engine to find this book. This book is actually changing hands for like £200 plus, because people are beginning to realise that this is pretty much the blueprint, written in 1969, published in 1970, for everything that's occurring right now in terms of the technotronic control grid.
So the next one we've got there, is that the PNAC document?
Well, it is the PNAC document, but the link again is our good friend Brzezinski. Because in the 1990s, Clinton didn't really like Brzezinski. So Brzezinski, who was created effectively to be the Democrat version of Kissinger. Right. So it's Kissinger that holds fort when Republicans in the White House, and traditionally it's been Brzezinski when Democrats in the White House. But Clinton didn't really like Brzezinski too much, so Brzezinski was forced back into academia, and he wrote a number of books through the early 1990s. But the seminal book is this book, The Grand Chessboard, right, where in 1997, Brzezinski is actually making the observation that 6 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the demise of the Soviet Empire, the US is missing the opportunity to establish itself as the dominant superpower on the planet. And in fact, he comes up with the term superpower. So, and in this document, he says that the reality is that even if an American government did now decide that it wanted to establish itself as the dominant player, the American people don't have the stomach to support such an aggressive agenda. And so he makes the observation in here, and he says that actually the only way in which the American people will support this agenda is if there is some external threat. And he makes the observation that he says that this external threat may have to be created. So
that's in 1997.
That's in 1997.
Then the Republicans get elected, and then we get 9/11.
A year later, there was a document written by the PNAC group, which included the likes of Cheney and Rumsfeld, to Bill Clinton, effectively telling him that he actually needed to get in and topple Saddam and take control of Iraqi oil resources, but Clinton didn't act on it. But then that same group, not including Brzezinski, but the Rumsfelds and the Cheneys and a number of other extreme neocons who followed the Straussian philosophy of neoconservatism. And they produced this document, which was published in September of 2000, Rebuilding America's Defenses, Strategy, Forces and Resources for a new century. And this is effectively getting into the detail of what Brzezinski was proposing in broad brush, 3 years previously in 1997. And in this document is the infamous phrase, it's on page 51, I know this. And on page 51, here's the phrase, it says, "Further, the process of transformation," which is effectively America becoming the dominant player on the planet, "even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor." Now, this document could be dismissed as the work of political fantasists, but then when you turn to the back and you see the list of people that put their names to this document, 10 of the 27 people who have their names in this document went straight into George W. Bush's government in January of 2001. And of course, on September the 11th, 2001, they got their new Pearl Harbor.
Sure, sure. And the next document, Ian?
The next document is, these documents have both emerged post-Copenhagen. Copenhagen did not materialize as was anticipated. And this is something that really came out of left field. In fact, I recorded a presentation called The Green Agenda and Population Reduction just a few days into November of 2009. And in that presentation, I was making the observation that we were literally just a little over a month away from seeing the foundations laid in establishing the global governance, the wet dream of the neocons. And I said, unless something outrageous occurs, something that we can't even begin to comprehend right now, I said, unless something like this happens, we are going to see the first vestiges of the New World Order firmly established in, effectively, global legislation.
So their wet dream is a world government, essentially, that's what
Well,
you're
the
saying.
world government, which will be the puppet government of the global corporation. But then a few days later, we got that incredible event, which was the release of the ClimateGate emails. And the ClimateGate emails, despite what people try and say, but the reality is the ClimateGate emails prove beyond any reasonable doubt that the whole of the climate change agenda is a political construct. It has absolutely no foundation in science, and the climate scientists were all bought and paid for. And the analysis, the best analysis of the ClimateGate emails has been written by an Australian physics professor, a PhD physicist by the name of Dr. John P. Costella. And his document, which is simply called ClimateGate Analysis, can be found on the website assassinationscience.com. And this document removes any doubt that anybody may have about the artificial creation of the climate change agenda, which, of course, was discussed a generation and a half previously in the report from Iron Mountain. So Copenhagen was a bit of a damp squib compared to what it was intended to be. And so all of a sudden, the agenda had to be changed. And these two documents that have been produced, both by the Rockefeller Foundation, and one looks at Global Governance 2025, and it's looking at the various strategic options they may have, one for ensuring that they have global government in place by 2025, and looking at all the possible scenarios for accelerating that agenda.
Okay. Sounds pretty disgusting to me, Ian. We've got a question here, I think, from the audience.
I just wondered, there's sort of an agreement at the moment within the circle that there is no such thing as global warming. However, do you not think that the HARP and the HARP experiments and things that they've been doing since is affecting the climate?
Oh.
A massive question. I mean, I think that we've got to get... let's first of all acknowledge that one of the things that has transpired post-Copenhagen is that we have seen global warming morph into climate change, which is much more encompassing. But the climate's always changing. I mean, I don't think anybody's really got any problem with that statement. What we come into then is the debate as to whether it's changing in a direction that's beneficial to humanity or not, as the case might be. But I think you're onto something when you say that there is no question about weather manipulation. and that may certainly be helping to accelerate this agenda.
Okay, well, let's come on to the economy then, Ian. And we need to go back a few hundred years, I think, to when fractional reserve banking was established. Because the fractional reserve system is how money is created. Can you explain that for us, Ian?
Yeah, let's try and give it the sort of 3-minute synopsis.
Yeah.
I mean, fractional reserve banking came into Europe in 1609 when it was established in Amsterdam. And fractional reserve banking, let me describe it like this. Mayor Amstel Rothschild was on record as saying, you know, give me control of a nation's money and I care not who controls its laws. So the agenda of the bankers has literally been to get national governments to hand over to them total control of the money supply. And this has been really the quest of the Rothschilds and the central bankers for many hundreds of years. It's exactly what I was talking about last week when I talked about the multi-generational agenda of these people. They have, you know, very, very long-term game plans. Mm-hmm. This is a good opportunity to discuss, for example, how the Federal Reserve came into being in 1913, because it was actually the third attempt by the central bankers to take control of the American money supply. And the previous presidents, who had been totally against handing control of the money supply to the bankers, they're easy to identify because they were the ones that were assassinated. And of course, JFK, it is strongly conjectured that one of the reasons that he was assassinated was because he had a game plan to remove control of the economy from the central banks and take it back under the guise of the American people. To establish a central bank, to take control of a nation's economy, all you need is an act of parliament or a presidential decree, mm-hmm. which is, of course, what Woodrow Wilson signed in 1913. Once that decree is signed, the bankers from that point forward know they're on to a winner, because all they need to start the process is a ledger or a spreadsheet, and they literally punch in a number. And let's say, for example, they start with $1 million. And it doesn't even have to exist, but let's say they punch in $1 million. They then use a fractional reserve ratio to multiply it. And then that's the money they start to put in the economy. But the real point is, every single dollar, pound or euro that goes into the economy from that moment forward is debt. And it's debt that is owed to the central bankers. And of course, there is interest to be paid on that debt, which goes to the central bankers.
I mean, it seems preposterous to me that any sovereign nation should be in debt, because it should always have authority to create its own currency. But it's in private hands. So
while we're on the historical beginning moment, it's terribly important historical beginning, I suggest that the actual moment in Britain when that started was 1694, when the Bank of England, a so-called Bank of England, with a bunch of sort of Amsterdam people put forward some gold, that floated the money that the king could use for his wars. And I think they multiplied it about 15 times, the actual gold compared with the paper money laundered. And Isaac Newton was president of the Mint, and that gave it a certain credibility and gravitas. And so that was when the whole hoax began.
The whole fractional reserve became
in the UK
official in that year.
The idea of nations,
it took a bit longer in America.
Nations as a whole, imagining that they're in debt, which is what you're pointing out is deeply irrational. That began at that moment, and it's been accumulating ever since. The national debt in this country has been accumulating arithmetically ever since that moment when it began.
Well, of course it does, because that's exactly the game plan. So what happens is the game plan right from the outset is to asset strip completely. Asset strip the government, the corporations, the businesses, and the individuals. So that's why I say it's a multi-generational agenda. So the process of stripping starts on the basis that you put the money in, which is then owed back to you, but it's owed back to you with interest. But the interest wasn't put in. So the interest has to come out of the accumulated wealth of the nation. So what happens is, year on year, every year, little by little, the nation's wealth is eroded until you get to the point of Iceland or Ireland, where basically there is nothing left.
Okay, Ian, well, we're going to go for a short break, and after the break we're going to look at instances where people have managed to break out of the fractional reserve system.
In May 2012, Richard D. Hall will be speaking throughout the UK and Ireland. Ticket and venue details can be found on the richplanet.net website.
Welcome back. I'm talking to Ian R. Crane about the monetary system. Now then, Ian, is it possible for small groups to actually break free from the monetary system and create their own currency?
Yes, it is. Although they bring down the wrath of the global banksters upon them. And one example that springs to mind is the Ruby Ridge incident, which I think is nearly some 30-odd years ago now. But Ruby Ridge, the official version of history, shows that the Ruby Ridge community was a white supremacist community and therefore was a threat to the Republican nation. In reality, it's way deeper than that, as one would expect. And in reality, what had happened is the Ruby Ridge community had established an alternative bartering system, basically, but using US dollars. But what they had done as a community, they were starting to provide finances for entrepreneurs who were looking to set up businesses. And their model was absolutely unique, because what they did was when an entrepreneur had an idea, he came along to the Ruby Ridge community, presented the idea, and if they thought it was a good idea, then they effectively entered into a partnership. And if ultimately the business didn't work, there was nothing to repay, because the community had accepted their part in the fact that it failed. If, on the other hand, it was a success, then obviously the money that had been loaned was repaid. And instead of setting an interest rate, they basically left it to the business owner to determine what it was that he wanted to put back into the community to enable the community to continue to develop other businesses. And this was tremendously successful. And it went out beyond the community into a wider and wider arena. And eventually, of course, the central banksters realized that this was a potential threat to their monopoly. And so they contrived what became known as the Ruby Ridge Massacre. So this was a classic example of an alternative currency system being established that was proving to not only be popular but also very effective, and it was taking earnings, i.e. interest, away from the central banks.
And they were worried that that might spread to other communities.
Exactly.
People doing that.
Now there are other schemes that are starting to take hold. I mean, one that seems to have some real traction is the Berkshire. I think it's called the Berkshire Share Arrangement or whatever, which is in New England. And this is definitely, it's embryonic at the moment, but I think it's got some legs. There's a number of other local economic trading systems that have been put in place, but most of them have been more PR exercise. I mean, things like the Totnes Pound and the Lewis Pound, which were initiated by their local transition towns. I mean, with all due respect, these are nothing more than PR claims. I mean, I live in Totnes. I've lived in Totnes for 7 years. I've never seen a Totnes pound. So, it's obviously not something that's got any real traction. But, what I think we're actually going to need to happen, perhaps, is the total meltdown that is happening right now. We're well into the sort of final stages of that. And literally then trigger something in people's consciousness that just says enough is enough.
Now this meltdown, as you call it, really has been allowed to happen because of fiat currency. In fiat currency, i.e. paper money, the money itself has no actual value. But there's nothing intrinsically wrong with fiat currency as long as the amount of fiat currency that's in circulation reflects the value of goods and services in that economy. Am I right?
That's absolutely correct. And in fact, what we can see is that this meltdown was really kicked off on August the 15th, 1971. And this was the moment that, and this was really a Kissinger, James A. Baker strategy, where they effectively instructed Nixon to remove the US dollar from the gold standard. I mean, up until that point, in theory, if not in practice, any US citizen could go along to their bank and demand an ounce of gold in exchange for $35. So it was very well understood that basically $35 represented an ounce of gold.
And that relationship never changed It was always 35 then, or
give or take, but
right,
yeah.
Okay.
But it was pretty much, yes,
Right.
it was $35, yeah,
Right.
because it was $35 when, set at $35 when the US government confiscated their citizens' gold in 1933 as well. And they got $35 in return for handing their gold over. But in 1971, when the US dollar was removed from the gold standard, 2 years later, Kissinger and James A. Baker III used the opportunity to establish the foundations for globalization, which back then was meant to represent effectively US domination. And the way in which this was done was the 1973 oil crisis. This is the second Israel-Arab war. This crisis was used to artificially hike the price of oil. So OPEC, the vast majority of people still think that the price of oil jumped by 400% in 1973 because OPEC were using it as a lever against the US support for Israel. In reality, what happened is that Kissinger went to OPEC. In fact, he went to Sheikh Yamani, who at the time was the Saudi oil minister, and he said, we need to use this opportunity to increase the price of oil by 400%. And Yamani, who could see that the only apparent winner for this was the oil-producing countries, said, well, okay, if you like. And Yamani actually went to the Shah of Iran and told him that they needed to increase the price of oil by 400%. And he said, no, the Americans will never buy it. And then Yamani actually said, well, actually, it's Kissinger that told us we want to do it. And you say, well, why would they want to do it? Well, because they needed to be able to tell the American people that they had to blame somebody else for the hike in oil prices. But the purpose was this. The US at the time was giving Israel, and continues to give Israel, $3.6 billion a year. Now, the reason it gives Israel that money is so that Israel can use that money to ostensibly buy American arms. Now, America wanted to be able to sell arms to a much broader range of nations around the world. Now, what it needed to do was to create an economy where those nations could afford to buy American arms. So what it decided to do was to declare that America was no longer self-sufficient in oil and it therefore needed to import oil. It demanded that countries like Saudi use American oil companies to further explore and develop their oil-filled reserves. So what we have from 1973, we have the US effectively using this opportunity to create the petrodollar as the global reserve currency. But what it was doing was it was effectively throwing this fiat currency into the global arena, and those countries could obviously then use that money to buy ostensibly American products. And from that moment forward, the US dollar has been depreciating in value ever since. So back in 1971, $1 was worth 1/35 of an ounce of gold. Today, $1 is worth 1/2000th, nearest damn it, 1900th. 1/1900th of an ounce of gold. So you can see how much the dollar, the real purchasing power of the dollar, has devalued in the space of literally just 40 years.
I mean, you describe it as meltdown, Ian, but can the situation not be perpetuated indefinitely as long as they keep printing new money?
In theory, yes, it can. In theory, I mean, in theory, if the banksters took on the role of global parent, yes, they could. I mean, as a parent, when you lend your children money, you never expect to see it back, do you? Yeah. Ever. You know, and if you do get it back, it's a real bonus. I mean, a few years ago, I actually had the resources, and so I decided that I'd make a gesture, and I gave my father a cheque, and I said, Dad, you know, look, this is just a gesture, but, you know, I want to offer you something in return for everything I've ever borrowed off you. Thinking, of course, that he would say, no, it's all right. But he didn't. Anyway,
yes.
He said, thank you. But in reality, that's what happens. You know, we expect to bail out our children as they sort of work their way through life. And if the banksters took on the role of global parent and said, yeah, okay, you know, we're just going to keep pumping the money in. But they've suddenly decided, no, we've got you now. We've got you right where we need you. We've got the debt level to the point where we own you.
Yeah.
And like I said last week, the reality is that the agenda of those who believe themselves to be the rightful rulers of a planetary fiefdom is total ownership of everything that's on the planet and of every life form on it, every human life form on it.
Well, let's come on to these central banks, Ian, and who owns them, because I often hear this argument about who owns the Bank of England. Who owns the Bank of England?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, it's privately owned. You know, that period. It's a privately owned bank. You know, this myth that the Bank of England was nationalised in 1947, which I think was certainly was on Wikipedia when I last looked. I don't often look at Wikipedia. It's not exactly a reliable source. But I think there was a statement on there saying that it was nationalised in 1947. Well, as far as I can ascertain, the only thing about the Bank of England that's nationalised is the building.
Right.
There is nothing nationalised about the Bank of England. It is a private banking institution. As to who holds that ownership, we could debate for a long, long time. In reality, the Bank of England and its court of directors, the court of directors are appointed to make sure that certain segments of the community are represented and kept on message. And this is epitomised by the fact that one of the members of the court of directors of the Bank of England is none other than Brendan Barber. Now, his term of office, I think he's been on the board since about 6 or 7 years ago. I think his term of office comes to an end in May of next year. But Brendan Barber is the General Secretary of the Trade Union Congress. So once again, we can see here, you know, the prima facie evidence that the Trade Union Congress is effectively controlled opposition.
Right. So do you think, you know, their ultimate objective is to get rid of the dollar eventually?
Absolutely.
So what will Americans then use for trading?
Well, first of all,
products?
their move towards, if you like, the one world corporation. Part of this is to establish these economic groups, and of course they're well advanced with the EU. The legislation has been in place in Canada, the US and Mexico to establish the North American Union ever since October 2005. The crashing of the dollar, which may come about any time soon, is to be used to introduce a new currency, the Amero.
Right, so they crash it, right? Everyone's got, well, a lot of people will have debt, obviously, but some people have got money in their bank. They've got, say, they've got $10,000 in their bank. What would then happen?
Well, if you've got debt, you're in pretty good shape because it means that your debt is.
You think
the value of that debt is greatly reduced?
Right. So it wouldn't be transferred to the new currency.
In one way, shape or form.
Right.
But the reality is, more importantly, when you crash a currency, anybody who's got any existing wealth, it's wiped out. I mean, this has happened before, of course, in Brazil, in Argentina, and it targets very specifically the middle classes. What it does is it wipes out the accumulated wealth of the middle classes, which effectively means that they no longer have any kind of financial independence, and once again they become economic slaves. So the US dollar being crashed would wipe out the dollar holdings of US citizens. You replace it with Amero, which has some new nominal value. And then the ultimate game plan, we talked about it last week, which is to merge the North American Union with the European Union into the North Atlantic Union, and then to have a common currency between North America and the EU. But this particular wet dream of the banksters, I mean, is looking as though it's not going to happen, because, you know, what we're seeing right now is obviously the meltdown of the Eurozone. I mean, at very long last, we're starting to see discussion about the need for Greece to pull out of the euro. Well, this is exactly what they should have done, you know, 2.5 years ago. Just like Iceland, they should have followed Iceland's lead. Ireland should never, ever have underwritten the bankers' liability, but as we discussed last week, this was the spectre of Peter Sutherland, Dermot Gleeson, and Paul Gallagher forcing the Taoiseach, Brian Cowen, and his Chancellor, Brian Lenihan, forcing them to underwrite the debt of all Irish banks with the taxpayer. This should never have been allowed to happen.
I mean, it seems like you would, let's say you were starting from scratch, you know, if you wanted a system that was flawless or, you know, could be seen through, I'm just hypothetically, if you could design a note which changed colour, like changed gradually to red, proportional to how much of the money in the economy is debt, i.e. owned by the banksters, you know, and then you could actually see, you could see, you could see it happening, whereas, but it's all invisible to us, isn't it?
Absolutely.
The people can't really see the debt.
Yeah.
And this is the problem, that they just continue on the mouse wheel, just accepting it all.
Keep borrowing more and more money.
Yeah. Yes, Nick.
If I could just come back to the Bank of England, you've emphasised that it was not nationalised and that it's run by private investors. Let's say the Bank of England gets, say, 2% interest on all the money it's put out. Does that mean that that totally fabulous sum of money that it's getting from interest is going to unknown persons?
Yes.
Do we really not know who's getting that
Exactly.
fabulous sum?
We don't know.
Wow.
And in fact, it's 0.5%, by the way. Bank rate is 0.5%. The banks, when they lend each other money from the central bank down through the banking system, the bank rate, i.e. bank lending rate to banks, is 0.5%. So then it is which gives you an idea of how much money the banks are making when they're charging much higher levels of interest, to the money that they're lending governments, businesses, and individuals.
I mean, some people say it's owned in part, at least, by our royal family, the royal family. And we had the story in the news the other day, well, a little while back, of the fact that the Queen couldn't afford the annual party or something like this because, and I just personally didn't buy that at all.
Well, it's absurd. It's absurd.
Any more questions?
If you get rid of all the debt, that would be great, obviously, but what do you do about the stock market? Because they're still creating money out of nothing by moving it from here to here. It's all just figures on a board, really. Nothing's changed. The amount of goods has not changed. No. Yeah. So what do you do about that?
We've got to basically do what Iceland has done. We've got to do what North Dakota did in 1922. We've got to do what Venezuela is still doing, what Iran is still doing, which is basically establish a bank that is truly a Bank of England. We've got to have a pound. I mean, let's go back to Ireland, because Ireland's a basket case at the moment. Ireland needs to re-establish the punt. I mean, they can call it what they like, but they need to re-establish the punt. And they need to effectively say, OK, we're just getting out of the euro, and basically start from scratch and say that basically we're going to put money into the system. Yeah, we'll buy up your euros because we can use those euros to trade with other eurozone countries. But ostensibly, we're going to create an economy centred on Ireland. And yes, it's going to be extremely tough in the short term, just like Iceland was and remains extremely tough right now. But it provides an absolutely solid foundation for development. And it creates the opportunity for local control. Because like you rightly said, Richard, those controls that need to be in place are things like setting interest rates. So that if you've got more money, if you think that the economy can absorb more money or needs more stimulus, you lower interest rates to get the money out there. If you want to slow down the amount of borrowing, you raise interest rates. You cannot have central interest rates set in Germany for an economy that's, basically a completely different structure. So we've literally got to get back to national economies. The problem is, and that's why you're not seeing the likes of... Have you ever seen David Cameron actually discuss and debate the Icelandic experience? We're still in a situation in the UK where last year 38,000 people lost their homes. The forecast this year in the UK is that 53,000 people will lose their homes. How many people in Iceland have lost their home since the economy collapsed in 2008? How many people? None. None, because the Icelandic government immediately stated that this is not the fault of the Icelandic people. It is the Icelandic banks that are creating the problem, and we will not penalise the Icelandic people by having them live in a state of fear where they think they're going to lose their home. And actually removing that fear has been a big part of what has brought this sort of collective creativity and commitment to re-establish their economy.
OK then, Ian, well, that's all we've got time for, and I think that's a good message to finish on, for people to look at the Icelandic economy and what has happened in that country, because there's no reason why that can't happen in this country or anywhere else. So thanks very much indeed for coming in.
Thank you,
Ian,
Richard.
and thanks to our audience. And on next week's show, the subject on the agenda will be the secrets of the American military organization known as NASA. How much do they really know about UFOs, and have they got their own? Join us again next week, but until then, remember, believe none of what you hear and only half of what you see. I'm Richard D. Hall. Good night.